And that moment of recognition is characterized by grief. These are losses, but because they are losses, you carry in your heart, in your mind, and in your soul that they may not look like losses to people around you. So let's talk a little bit about the pattern of grief that is such a classical part of narcissistic abuse. This, to me, grief, may be one of the most difficult of all of the patterns, the fallout, if you will, of narcissistic abuse. I will be doing a series on grief after the loss of a narcissistic relationship in a few months. But for now, I want to break down some of the brass tacks of narcissistic relationship grief here because it is such a classical part, the sense of grief, of what a person going through a narcissistic relationship goes through. So for now, I'm really going to talk about grief as an artifact of narcissistic abuse. Grief is a response to loss. We traditionally think of it in terms of death, but it can also be the loss of a relationship. For example, a divorce. We might see grief in the face of the loss of a job, the loss of a home, and we even can observe grief reactions during major transitions. For example, a person moving to a new city or a new country and leaving their home behind. Grief is a part of the human experience, and psychologists have been writing about it since there was psychology, and humans have been experiencing guilt since there were humans. We build rituals around grief, and every culture has some sort of system, every religion has some sort of system it uses to manage this experience of grief. We go through an experience called bereavement. That's a part of grief, which can feel like depression. It's a natural part of the process of letting go. And during the bereavement period, people are generally quite sad. But the grief of narcissistic abuse or associated with narcissistic abuse is very difficult because usually no one's dead, and the belief is that you should be relieved, for example, that the relationship is done. But still, you're sad. What are you grieving when you're experiencing narcissistic abuse? You're grieving lots of stuff. You're grieving what you believed would have been or could have been in this relationship. You're grieving your childhood. You're grieving your loss of trust. You're grieving your loss of faith in other human beings. You're grieving your lost opportunities. You are grieving the idea you had about what life could be about and what love could be about. You're grieving your belief that the world is fair and just. And that is a lot to grieve. If you experienced any form of narcissistic abuse as a child, you didn't understand that it was grief that was a part of what you were experiencing, even as a child. A childhood with a narcissistic parent can be chronically disappointing, largely because the narcissistic individual puts his or her needs ahead of everyone else. So there can be missed activities, missed deadlines, missed school events, missed everything that's the stuff of childhood. But there's also grief of that significant developmental window. This can result in a sense of melancholy that wafts through a childhood, a melancholy that is all too familiar to survivors of narcissistic abuse. It's a heaviness that we all carry in us. You'll see that lifelong survivors of narcissistic abuse smile, but there's a sadness that lurks right behind it. However, other survivors often typically see it and get it. In adulthood, decisions around maintaining relationships with your narcissistic parent or parents can get quite complicated. Their presence can sometimes trigger a sense of grief, the childhood loss, the relationship you had wanted to have with a parent. And since they probably didn't get it when you were a kid and probably aren't going to get it now, the same gaslighting and passive-aggressive barge barbs continue to characterize your relationship. It's as though you play the grief over and over again every time you see them. In adult relationships with a partner, spouse, it can be quite similar. The relationship is, or was, quite miserable, and yet you grieve it when it's done. This is a classical part of narcissistic abuse and a confusing one when a relationship ends. Many people will mistake this sense of grief and think, oh no, maybe I made a mistake, I'm grieving this, and I can have it back, and then you fall back in. Remember that a lot of narcissistic relationship happens in your head. You try to convince yourself that things were better than they actually were. And you can start believing that pseudo-reality and grieve the story that you made up in your head. The grief elements of narcissistic abuse are often experienced similarly to the depression piece, as well as other elements of narcissistic abuse: sadness, regret, confusion, anger, lots of negative mood states. But the confusion is the yearning that can still be there for you around that relationship. Odds are that the yearning you're experiencing is for things that either didn't exist in the relationship, the fantasy that you had to construct about the relationship, or are related to the trauma bond and the addictive compulsion to get back into it. And neither of those patterns are healthy. Healthy grief is a natural process that resolves over time, especially when there is support. There's a recent video I did on what happens when a narcissist in your life dies, and I talk about the complicated grief and the confusion that happens when someone with whom you've had such a complicated relationship with actually passes on. But the grief of narcissistic abuse happens whether the narcissist is alive or not. It's less about grieving the actual person, and in some ways becomes even more about grieving the hope you had had for that particular relationship, the time you may have lost to it, and the pieces of yourself you gave up to it. So, what do you do in the face of grief? First, always remember that grief is a natural process of letting go. Support it. Support it through therapy, through support groups, ideally for support groups designed for survivors of narcissistic abuse, other techniques such as mindfulness, meditation, and meaningful activities in your life. Second, don't let the grief confuse you. It isn't a sign that you did the wrong thing, but rather it's a natural process of letting go. And in the case of narcissistic abuse, a complicated process of letting go. Third, if the grief starts to careen into more substantial symptoms of depression or anxiety, then you must pay attention and must consider therapy, because the key to addressing negative emotional symptoms such as depression and anxiety are to catch it early, or at a minimum, please consult your primary health care provider. Fourth, please consider journaling. It's a good process to see how you're slowly letting this relationship go over time. There will definitely be good days and bad days, triggered days and easier days, but over time, if you can witness the improvement, it can substantiate your commitment to growth and letting go. Fifth, there are really no true do-overs in life. There's no reset button. So acceptance becomes key. It can be painful to reflect on a childhood that might have been lost to narcissistic abuse, or 20 or 30 or 40 years spent in a toxic marriage. No, you can't bring that time back by rumination. But a big part of the resolution of grief is acceptance. This is your life story, and it's rich and it's beautiful, and you learned a lot. If you've survived narcissistic abuse, you are actually stronger than most people. Take that strength and use that time that you have in front of you, see it as a gift, and please use it well. People who are in narcissistic relationships are often struck about where the grief hits them. They'll just be kind of reading a book, and a very common one is watching something and they'll be surprised by it. So this is really going to take that on. The surprising place that narcissistic grief can sneak up on you. Okay? And again, this is a very interesting phenomenon I've noticed. The grief over a narcissistic relationship is a very, very unique grief. Okay? So it's not the sort of grief of what we typically associate with loss, like we'd see it someone dying or a relationship ending or losing a job. It's not even the grief of losing something like a house burning down or a car getting totaled or losing stuff in a burglary or in a robbery, which are losses which can lead to grief. The grief of a narcissistic relationship is something more unique. It's the loss of a narrative, a loss of innocence. It's the loss, it can be the loss of a family, a loss of hope, a loss of what you hoped life could be, a loss of time, a loss of potential, a loss of opportunity. People waste years in these relationships, and then, once they see it clearly, regret all that had been lost. People maintained narratives about happy families. They would wonder why there was an incongruence, a disconnect between what they so desperately wanted to be true and what the situation in front of them actually was. And that moment of recognition is characterized by grief. These are losses, but because they are losses, you carry in your heart, in your mind, and in your soul that they may not look like losses to people around you. And you may go through this bizarre experience of grief that you don't even identify as grief. So that's why so many people going through this saying, I feel like I'm losing my mind. And I'm like, no, it's actually grief. Now, what this video takes on is how this grief sneaks up on you in a very, very interesting and surprising way. Comes up when you're watching a movie or a TV show. It's amazing how often I have talked with many, many survivors of narcissistic relationships and narcissistic abuse who will talk about how a scene in a movie or show that, I don't know, the scene in the movie or the show isn't even really that consequential, that the survivor will actually find themselves tearful and really sad and not be able to hold those tears back. For example, it may be a scene in which a mother is deeply empathic toward a child, or a father is very loving towards their family. It could be any number of compassionate scenes from a marriage. But what catches people who have been through narcissistic relationships by surprise is the strength, how overpowered they feel, and the strength of their reaction, especially to scenes that weren't even meant to be that evocative. In fact, some people have said they were actually a little bit embarrassed because the scene which made them cry wasn't actually, probably not even intended to be a tearjerker scene. But in the context of their lives, of their unique griefs, the simple act of maybe kindness or sacrifice by a character in a film, a person playing a partner or a parent, represented something they so desperately yearned for and finally recognized that they would never get, and would be watching that all play out in a story and just almost amplifying the thing that was missing from their lives. If you have experienced narcissistic abuse, just take a minute. I'd love for you to think about the last scene in a show or a movie that really got to you And it wasn't the usual kind of tearjerker scene. And actually, if you want, drop that in the comments, like, yeah, the scene was from this particular movie. And pay attention to what that scene was about. Because actually, the tearjerker scene and what evokes this from you could give you some real insight into your grief. Someone was actually recently sharing with me a scene in a film in which the lead character was a young woman. And the young woman had a deeply, like, sort of really warm, empathic, connected relationship with her father. And the father had a really wonderful sense of humor. He was empathic, he was available, and he made sacrifices for his family and for his children without drawing attention to them. He wasn't a victim, nothing like that. In an actual relatively ordinary scene, an inconsequential scene in this movie, when the father brought a little birthday cake to the daughter on the morning of her birthday, this person was telling me she started crying. And people were looking at her strangely. And then she remembered crying again when there was a scene where the father sacrificed an important opportunity he had for himself. He sacrificed it in favor of his son. And she said she just couldn't stop crying. And she was caught off guard by her reaction to these scenes. And even though she had given up on her own relationship with her narcissistic father a long time ago, the potency of the reaction after all these years as it came through the film struck her. And it's interesting because she was also going through a narcissistically abusive intimate relationship. But the never-ending grief of wishing it had been something different with her father, of wondering what a life with a non-rageful, empathic, giving, and open-hearted father who really saw her, she wondered, what would that be like? To recognize that she would go through this life without ever knowing that experience. That's grief. And as she beautifully put it, most days, she didn't even think about it. It didn't even cross her mind. She just sort of, her father had his life. He made almost no attempt to even maintain any kind of relationship with her whatsoever. And she herself had her own full life. But the grief was there, hidden away, and reactivated through a simple story of a father and a daughter in a film. And it wasn't even supposed to be a father-daughter film. That was really sort of a sideline story in the film. It's interesting, when I think about the last time I cried during a TV show, it was actually during an absolutely absurd comedy show. And as the series comes to an end, these characters who had actually been really treated horribly and bullied by other people throughout the course of the series, they got very, very happy endings, and they succeeded on their own terms and really authentically. I watched this last episode, I started crying. And my children, because this is a comedy show, looked at me as though I had literally lost my mind. This was not meant to be a poignant scene. So as I went to bed that night, I wondered, what was it that made me so weepy at such a silly scene? And I had to say that I recognized that I identified with the scene. I identified with being told no, and this idea that you're never going to make it, or who do you think you are? And these characters, they retained their good humor all the way through the series, and for once, for one damn time, karma worked out the way you hope it does, because these characters were so sweet. And maybe, in my case, that's the toll of working on narcissistic abuse. Because so rarely in the lives of the folks I work with, the story rarely ends up fair. Maybe it wasn't about the happy ending of this silly show that made me cry, but it was actually the fact that it was a just ending. Because, again, that is so rarely how it ends up for survivors of narcissistic abuse. Survivors of narcissistic abuse always have to look past the seeming injustice, the actual injustice of the situation, and find a way to tell the story of their life in this relationship so it feels endurable, and find some meaning in the grief. Because I do grieve for the unfairness that is narcissistic abuse and see the ongoing toll it takes on people who really do almost grieve that sense of justice. So that said, I gotta ask it again. Have you ever found yourself crying at an unexpected time in a movie? Not the tearjerker that gets everyone, but that scene, just like that silly scene I'm telling you about, that really got you by surprise. What was that show? And maybe even what was that scene? And was it a place that gave you a glimpse into your narcissistic grief? Listen, drop that scene or that film or show or whatever in the comments, and who knows? Maybe somebody looking at these comments and watching this video will end up watching that scene, and it could end up being someone's relief and release as well. You never know when you're going to get that little tiny bit of release and healing. Is the issue of narcissistic grief, and very specifically how people who are experiencing the grief over a narcissistic relationship often feel very judged. The acceptance of a narcissistic relationship is often accompanied by tremendous grief. Grief is very much a universal part of the experience of people in these relationships and of people leaving these relationships. It's the acceptance that this is not going to change. The acceptance that it will never get better. The acceptance that you do not get to go backwards and get a do-over of childhood with more responsive or more available parents. It's the acceptance, perhaps, that your children will not get the vision you had of them, of two parents living under one roof model of a happy childhood. It's the acceptance that this is not how you thought your love story would go. This acceptance happens regardless of whether you leave the relationship or stay. And not everyone gets to acceptance, but if you don't, you're constantly living in a world of disappointment. And obviously, if you leave the relationship, or your partner leaves the relationship, or your family decides to step away, then there is the grief of the actual loss of a relationship. So it's losses all around, whether it's the loss of an idea or the loss of the actual relationship. We often reserve the term grief for the loss associated with death. But that's only just one piece of the pie of grief. Grief, ultimately, is about loss. Meaningful, profound loss. The challenge is that while we in the mental health space may understand that others may not, and when you say you're experiencing grief, the first thing you may get back is, why? What grief? Nobody's dead. The experience of judgment that people in narcissistic relationships have to face is actually really unsettling for them as they go through their process of healing. It's either gaslighting. You'll hear things like, all relationships are tough. No family is perfect. It can't be that bad. Or it's the sense of shame that survivors feel for staying. They don't feel, for example, people stay in these relationships because they don't feel ready to leave. They feel too confused and they hold back on sharing with other people about the mess that their relationship is, for fear of being judged when they stay in their relationship, and of their partner, or maybe it's the case it's a family member who's the narcissistic person. They know that if they talk too much about it, other people will view that person poorly, and that's going to be a problem if they decide to stay in that relationship. Or there's the isolation that comes from hearing about other people's healthier marriages or relationships or families, and either you might lie or soft pedal what your situation is so you can stay in the conversation to avoid a sense of shame, or just not talk at all, which is very isolating. Or you might have the experience of going into therapy and being told about your anxiety and being told, oh, you're very anxious, and maybe once you work on your anxiety, things will be easier in your relationship because your anxiety is probably really problematic for your partner. So it's pretty much judgment all the time for people who are going through grief. And then you may really start hitting it with the grief. It's as though the term has been annexed in a way that only certain people get to use it, right? You have a dead parent, then you get to talk about grief. If you have a narcissistic parent that you have to go no contact with, then people are going to tell you you're being difficult. If you have a dead spouse, you get to call it grief. If you have to face the unending anguish of having to either manage a toxic marriage or a toxic divorce and the contentious issues around joint custody, you'll hear back from people, oh, divorce is hard. You have a dead sibling, that gets to be called grief. If you have a sibling who continues to triangulate and divide the family and is making a mess of family accounts, businesses, trusts, or mistreating other family members, you'll get back, oh, families are tough, but you got to stick together. And what happens then is that the person enduring this narcissistic relationship feels as though they are not entitled to the language and the process of grief. And they get pushed into the language of a person who just has difficult and tense relationships and is just sort of struggling to figure all that out, instead of the far more robust vocabulary of grief. Most people have difficulty understanding that grief can be about the loss of what we hoped for: a loving parent, a happy family, a healthy marriage. And so it may not even be about a person, but a narrative, a simple want. I don't think, actually, it's aspirational to hope for loving parents. I think that's a basic human want, a very basic human deserving need. And that when a person gets into adulthood and recognizes that they didn't have the important psychological stuff of childhood that shapes a confident adult, it hurts. And a lot of time can get wasted ruminating about how could it have been different. Many people in adulthood look back at the child they were, looking to a parent or parents for consistency, validation, safety, compassion, support, and unconditional love. And it hurts to imagine what their child selves went through. People who endure this recognize that you cannot go backwards and unring that bell, but you can grieve it not happening in the first place. I've talked over and over about the loss of innocence that these relationships represent. Many people who are going through narcissistic relationships often feel that they have become cynical, for lack of a better word. They wanted to be open-eyed and open-hearted and optimistic and warm and fuzzy, and feel that because of this narcissistic relational experience, that open-heartedness has been taken. More grief over losing that. It'll take a minute, but someday you'll see that cynicism as discernment. Many people going through narcissistic grief have told me that others have said it isn't grief, that they are using the wrong word. And the gaslighting continues, basically, just keeps going on and on and on, that relationships end and people have problems, and that doesn't make it grief. So a lot of people will just sort of challenge your use of this word. Yes, it does. Something important and heartfelt was lost. Even if it was your belief system, that's extraordinarily important, something important being lost. When grief is judged, it impedes the process of grief. A person whose grief is judged may censor their experience or not allow it to flow out of them, or identify it as grief and or something related to grief. And when we are not given the space to have our grief, if we try to rush through it, if we try to avoid it, if we try to skip it, it comes back at us. And that can result in longer-term mental health issues, physical illness, stress, and distraction. Grief is simply one of those things that you cannot outrun. Grief also looks different after a person has experienced narcissistic abuse. And this goes beyond the scope of this video. But some stages of the grief process, such as anger, actually do look different than what we would consider to be traditional grief. In grief, for example, after a death, a person may be angry that a person who's died is gone or that they went too soon. It's sort of almost an anger at the world at losing this person. In grief from narcissistic abuse, the anger is far more wide and complex. Anger that someone could behave like this. Anger that it happened to you. Anger that you didn't get out of the relationship sooner. Anger at getting bad advice about the relationship and sticking around because you kept fostering the hope. Anger at not understanding the dynamics of a narcissistic relationship. The complexity of the grief stages means that it takes a while, and that's the nature of grief. It takes as long as it takes. I often liken grief to the phases of the moon. You can't rush it, you can't slow it down. The full moon is always going to come sometime within 28 days. It's a process, and you can't wish it to come faster. Now, unlike the moon, grief doesn't follow a schedule. But just like that moon, you can't wish it away, and it takes as long as it takes. Judging narcissistic grief is like judging any emotion for a person. To judge someone's emotion is disrespectful, abusive, and it is a form of gaslighting. If someone tells you that you are not grieving, sadly, it means one more relationship you have to give a hard look at and assess at whether this relationship is healthy for you. And then in the midst of grief, the idea of more changes, more losses, more disappointments can feel overwhelming. Your experience of loss of relationship, loss of hope, loss of innocence is real. I hope this channel and other communities out there are showing you this, that these losses are real, no matter what it is you lost, and that because these losses are real and profound, grief is a meaningful way to characterize this. You do not ever need to prove your feelings or experience to anyone, and that pressure survivors of narcissistic relationships have, that they have to show up with proof of what happened, proof of their suffering, proof, look, this is what this person did. One of the most important things we can say to survivors of these kinds of traumatic relationships is, I believe you. And then go from there. How do you recover from the lie? Sometimes even feeling like you lived a double life. So let's talk about that. So when we think about the grief of the narcissistic relationship, there are lots of things that people are grieving. They're grieving the actual relationship. They may be grieving never having had a normal childhood, grieving that belief in happy endings, grieving that they won't be able to give their child that intact family, grieving getting divorced when you vowed you would never let that happen. It's not just the simple stuff, like the loss of a marriage or the death of a loved one. It's very nuanced grief. But the one barrier that really complicates narcissistic grief is having to recover from the lies, from the fiction. When people slowly decide to detach from a narcissistic relationship and then actually go through the rigors of getting out of a narcissistic relationship, they are exhausted because the divorces are messy and contentious. The family disapproval is strong. Finding a new job is difficult. Being ostracized from a group of friends is painful. It doesn't matter what kind of relationship you are trying to exit, it is very, very difficult. But the piece around lying and the lies you were told and recovering from those lies is a different kind of grief and recovery. After the initial dust settles, people look back and start feeling like they were in a Black Mirror episode and ask themselves, was any of that real? Did that relationship, what just happen? And as the lies get unearthed, when you recognize that a partner actually had been texting their lover during your birthday party, or your parent did not share lies that if you had known the truth, would have changed major life decisions you made, or changed things that affected the course of your life. That your partner chose to stay married to you because it was financially more expedient than getting a divorce, and they didn't stay because they loved you. That all of the future fakes were fake, and all of those promised things never came to fruition and were never going to happen. You were never going to do the things they married, like move closer to family, or have the support to go back to school, or take a vacation, or have kids. And now it's too late to address many of those things. So not only is it the grief of the lies, meaning you didn't or couldn't do some things, but the confusion about what was actually real in your life. It can leave people in a ruminating fog, staring at old photographs and wondering, I was smiling, but now I know it was a lie. Was I happy? Were they happy? What just happened to me and what just happened in my life? When working with survivors, I often encourage them to divide things into different categories: episodes, contexts, and feelings. When people ask themselves, was my life real? It can be really challenging because, yeah, it was, as real as anything is, but the issue is not whether those things happen, but it's the interpretation and perception of those events that's getting challenged. So the question is not, when you look at the pictures, did we go to Italy? Obviously, yes, you did. You have the pictures of you standing in front of the Tower of Pisa, or the yellowed boarding pass stub, or the earrings you bought at a flea market. Yes, you were there. So that part was real. Yes, you did go to Italy. Yes, you did go to that restaurant, or stayed in that hotel, or whatever it was you did. That real part is the episode. The episode happened. But then, when you look at that smile and look at that photo, and you're both smiling big, and then you do the math and recognize, for example, that perhaps your partner's affair was actually happening at that time. You just didn't know it at the time. It doesn't take away the episode. You, in fact, did get on a plane and go to Italy, but it changes the context. You were actually in Italy with a person who was thinking about and communicating with someone else. The trip, the physical trip, was real, but the circumstances were not what you thought. And that shift in context can really do a number on your mind. Fact is, the people were smiling in the picture. We don't know, actually, though, why. Then there is the feeling part. You believed you had gone to Italy with a loving partner, maybe to address a rough patch in the relationship, or take your first trip together in years. That smiling picture. You recall being happy that day. Was your partner happy that day? Who the hell knows? Maybe they were. Maybe they were actually happy having a nice time in Italy with you because it's beautiful. And they were bolstered by whatever additional narcissistic supply their affair was giving them. Maybe they weren't happy. Maybe it was a white-knuckle trip for them, and they had planned to divorce you, so they were smiling through gritted teeth. And the feeling part is the part that really does a number on your grief and recovery, because you perceived a truth that your partner, just like in that picture with that big smile, was all in, or they were happy. You see that smiling picture? But in fact, it wasn't what you thought. A narcissistic relationship involves years, if not lifetimes, of wishful thinking, and all of that wishful thinking being drawn and rendered into a relationship. Basically, all of those justifications and hopes and beliefs in future faked promises becoming a sort of picture you have drawn of the relationship you want, the relationship you hope for, the relationship you wanted to believe in. When the lies slowly reveal themselves, the justifications are shown for what they are, and it is devastating. The cognitive dissonance, the trauma bond, all of that, the whole thing confuses you and leaves you really confused. A key element to narcissistic grief is rumination. You ruminate about the lies and why didn't I see any of this? Why didn't I leave when I saw the lies? And why didn't the people who knew about the lies say something to me? And you just play that loop over and over again. And then people who are caught in these relationships become really self-disparaging. You say things to yourself like, why was I so stupid? Why did I fall for it? Why didn't I believe the people who actually did tell me? Because we all fall for it. Cognitive dissonance is real, and we break it by making that picture to be what we want. We also put the focus on ourselves. We focus on doing everything we can to make the relationship look the way we want, and blame ourselves for not being perfect when it doesn't work. We put together the holidays, we put together the vacations, we put it together so we can convince ourselves, I'm in a good relationship. It is traumatic to feel that you were living a sort of double life. You see the truth of it now, but while you were in it, could not imagine that it was that. When I talk to long-term survivors, the rumination really takes a toll and draws them into their own heads. They think of their younger selves who still believed in all of it, who tried so hard, and they almost feel a sense of pity for that younger, seemingly naive person. Perhaps the grief is the loss of that younger self, or of the exhaustion of their hope in the unavailable and rejecting partner, parent, friend, whoever it was. This area of understanding narcissistic abuse is just now evolving. Their younger selves, we're just understanding narcissistic abuse now, so their younger selves would not have been able to find a therapist who would have actually gotten it. So there was no way to get to see the light. The rumination isn't just about the lies, but also about, if I had known then what I know now, if I had known what their behavior was about, I would not have spent so many years feeling crazy. It's also a rumination about spending time in a circumstance made harder by not knowing and self-blame. And then there is a period of time when a person looks back at what has happened in their narcissistic relationship and then is able to explain the episodes that made no sense at the time. The clarity, while potentially liberating, it's almost like breaking a code. It can leave a person working backwards to make sense of what just happened, but also feeling as though they are grieving for the hopeful person they once were, who was futilely waiting for change. Of all of the grief and recovery and harm patterns of narcissistic abuse, rumination is often cited as one of the most disruptive. It leads people to feel zoned out, stuck in the past. I often say, let it out, which is why therapy is so important. A good therapist will let you keep letting it out, and at some point, almost all of it will come out, but sharing it and bringing it into the light can help end the cycles and provide a validating and new perspective as well. In a way, the rumination can be a process of letting go and clearing space for the healthier stuff that will come. But please be patient with yourself. These things take time. There is really very few things that feel as bad as being duped. And when your life feels like it was one big dupe, you will often go back and play those episodes, but see them within new contexts and recognize that the feelings were not what you thought. Thanks again.